Part 16. My father's head turned and I followed his gaze. One of the doctors stepped up, another replica next to him. "Let her rest," he whispered harshly, and they turned and made themselves busy to the side of us. "Am I all me again?" I asked quietly, not sure how to word it. He nodded, still smiling, his eyes searching my face. "Yes, you are." I moved my elbows and forced myself up, my dad reaching behind my back and helping me. One of the doctors turned and quickly adjusted the bed so the back was up. My dad propped the pillows behind me and I watched him. He was shaking just a little and he looked so worn. His clothes were wrinkled, his suit, jacket, and tie gone. His shirt was partly unbuttoned, and his hair. I reached out and ran a hand through it, smoothing it back into place. "You look awful," I chuckled softly. Then he reached over, took me in his arms, and hugged me tightly. I leaned on his chest and then felt the tears run down my face. I turned into him, pulling my arms up to his chest, and sobbed long and hard. When I finally stopped, he was rocking me gently, and I had soaked the front of his shirt. I pulled away a little, looking up at him. He took one hand and wiped my tears. "What does this mean?" I asked, my voice shaky. "We don't know yet, Reina." His eyes looked worried. "But you made it back." I nodded. "But I'm not a vampire?" He lifted my chin. "You are, Reina, and that is all that matters. The rest is just minor details that we will figure out," he chuckled, and I smiled. "I don't still have a tail, do I?" My dad laughed then, and I shrugged. "That thing has a mind of its own." There was a knock on the door, and we both turned. The doctor stepped up and peered out, then turned to us. "It's Jonathan Hilver, sir," the man stated. My father looked at me and I looked down. I was in a soft blue gown and had thick white covers over me. I wiggled my toes, and when they responded, I nodded, quickly wiping the wetness from my face. My father turned and gestured to the sterile man, and he opened the door. Jonathan took a timid step in and then saw me and smiled. He walked over to the bed and looked at my father, who shrugged. "Like I said, she is Reina. She will do what no one else has." My dad's eyes sparkled with pride and happiness. Jonathan noticed his shirt but didn't comment on it. I grinned at them both, then put a hand on my chest and waited. "No heartbeat," I said, more amazed than anything. "We still aren't sure how this is going to affect you," my dad said carefully. I just nodded. How could they know? I was just happy to be here and to see my dad looking at me that way. Part of me was worried that he would shrink from me. "Where's Track?" I asked, looking around the large room. Everything was so sterile here. There was very little color, and it smelled of disinfectant and other things I didn't know. "He'll be in to see you shortly, I'm sure." My dad took a little too long to answer, and I frowned. "What happened? Is he okay?" He sat up and patted my hand that was now resting in my lap. "You've been through a lot, Reina. There's no need to—" "Dad, where's Track?" Now I was worried. People only avoided talking about something when there was bad news at the other end. He glanced at Jonathan, who nodded, and I wondered what they were doing. "When you changed back," my dad started, slowly. I could almost see him picking through his words. "You were a wolf, and scared." "Oh my God," I sat straight up. "What did I do?" He put his hands up. "He'll be fine, Reina. He's a werewolf, remember?" "Dad, tell me, what did I do?" My eyes watered and I looked towards the door. It opened then, and I smiled, seeing Track's face peek in. He saw me and smiled, stepping into the room. As he walked over, I noticed some scratches on his neck that disappeared under his shirt. I bit my lower lip. As he came closer, I saw a lump on the side of his head. "Oh, Track, I am so sorry," I said as more tears started to run down my face. Track frowned and then looked at my father. "She's okay now," he said, and Track nodded, stepping up next to the bed. "Nothing to be sorry for, Ray. Plus, I'm a quick healer." He winked at me, and I shook my head. "I didn't mean to. How bad is it?" Track laughed and shook his head. "It's a few scratches and bruises. Come on, Ray. It's me, remember?" Then he grinned. Phil, on the other hand. I slapped a hand over my mouth, and my dad and Jonathan shot him a hard look. Track leaned over and kissed my forehead. "Not to worry, Ray. We are pack. Phil came out better than me." Then he reached down and wiped my tears. "So will she keep leaking like this, or is it temporary?" I chuckled. It was nice to have someone not treating me like glass. Jonathan shook his head. "We don't know. It may be residual and will pass, or it may be that—" Track smiled at me. "That she is morphing into something in between a wolf and a vampire? Leave it to Ray to outdo us all." My dad chuckled and stood up. "I'm sure you don't want to stay in here any longer than you have to. Let's let the doctors have their turn at you and then get you to your room." I frowned as two of the white-coated men stepped up. Did they ever smile? Track stayed where he was, and they turned to him. "She will need a little privacy for a minute," one of them stated. He laughed. "I've already seen all there is to see." "Hey!" I shot out, and he shrugged. "What? You've seen me in my bare essentials." Jonathan made a noise that made me turn, but he smiled and stepped up. "The three of us will step right outside, and I will come back in and get you out of here as soon as they are done." I nodded, and when my father looked at Track, he shrugged. "Guess I'll have to tease you endlessly in a few minutes." I watched them walk across the room. Then they all turned and smiled at me as they walked out. The doctors swarmed me, and I laid there and coughed when they told me to, raised my legs or arms when instructed, and endured an endless list of tests, both physical and verbal. Finally, the one that seemed in charge nodded. "You may be taken back to your room. But you want to stay put for a while. One of us will be there with you for now. Then if things seem to have settled, we'll go from there." I went to argue but closed my mouth. I would take what freedom I could get. Plus, to be honest, a part of me was scared completely out of my mind. I was a vampire that changed into a full wolf and then changed back into whatever I was now. That had never been done. I had heard and remembered as much. I was glad that I had my dad and the pack and Jonathan and even the doctors. I didn't want to be destroyed. I didn't want to have this end me completely. If it meant living under a microscope for a while, I was okay with that. When they came back in, I went to stand up, but Jonathan shook his head. Then he scooped me up in his arms and started to walk out, with my dad and Track at his side. "I'm pretty sure I can walk," I chuckled. "Now what fun would that be?" Jonathan smiled, and I rolled my eyes. When we got to my room, I saw Michael standing there, but he was alone. "Where's Ander?" I asked my dad as we approached. "He's seeing to other things," he replied in a short voice tainted with irritation. Michael smiled at me and quickly opened the door. "I can probably walk all by myself," I explained to my guard as we stepped into the room. But they don't seem to want to find out." Michael chuckled, and Jonathan walked over and laid me on my bed. I moved myself into place and then sighed. "So how long do I have to stay here?" We turned to the doctor that walked in. He carried a large clipboard and had a plastic caddy with lots of important looking things poking out. For a full 24 hours, he stated, setting the caddy on my dresser. What? Track smiled at me. I can bring a TV in here, and we can chill and watch movies. You don't have to babysit me, I said weakly, hoping he wouldn't change his mind. Of course I do. You can't seem to stay out of trouble for very long. Then he shrugged. Phil and Ryan are still here. The others went back, and the tree liners went home. But they call all the time to see how things are doing. Did I really hurt you both? I asked, eyeing the scratches on his neck. You kicked our butts pretty good, but we're fine. Remember, we are werewolves. By the time you can get out of this bed, you won't even know I got beaten up by a girl. He grinned at me. I rolled my eyes but smiled. I'll go and get the TV and DVD player and some movies. Then he kissed the top of my head and trotted out of the room. My dad stepped up. I'm going to make some calls. The others are all waiting for an update on you. I nodded, and he hugged me. I love you, sweetheart, he said with so much emotion that I felt my nose tingle. I love you too, Dad, I whispered. I'll be back in a bit. Then he picked up a cell phone and sat it on the bed. Push 2 if you need me. I nodded, and he looked at me for a long minute and then stood and left. Jonathan took a seat on the side of the bed and looked at me. I'm sorry for being such a pain. Sorry? Reina, nothing that happened to you was any fault of yours. This is who you are. I'm glad you're better, though. For now, I chuckled. We'll find out what is happening. We'll learn from it. Am I going to die? I asked bluntly, and he flinched. I shrugged. Completely die. I have no heartbeat now, but I can cry. Do you know? He looked down at his hands. We don't know, Reina, he finally said in a forced voice. As you know, this has never happened before. You did basically die when you shifted back. We actually thought that we lost you for a few minutes. My eyes got wide and he rolled his shoulders. I shouldn't have said that. I put my hand on his. Yes, you should have. Thank you. My dad and Track won't tell me that, to spare me, but I want to know. I need to know what's happening. Before he could answer that, I looked towards my door. How many others besides Ander can't look at me anymore? His face tightened then. Forget him, Reina. You won't be seeing him or anyone else that has his reaction. I sighed, absently watching the doctor as he sat on a chair and put a laptop on a tray in front of him. My brows creased. I didn't remember him bringing in either. Then I looked back at Jonathan, his gray eyes watching me in a way I didn't quite understand. I need someone who'll be honest with me, I stated quietly. He looked down and then moved up closer to me. I want to give you anything and everything you could ever want, he whispered, and I stiffened. His eyes were locked on mine, and I couldn't seem to turn away. I thought I lost you today. Completely. I didn't like that feeling at all, he chuckled at that, as it did sound a bit cheesy. He looked away, then turned back. I'll be as honest with you as I can, but I will not tell you things just to gain any points with you. I will not scare you or expose you to things that are not facts either. I blinked hard. Suddenly my mind completely blank. I couldn't think of a response, and I still couldn't turn away from him. He gave me a small smile. I might have said too much already. When I simply stared, he reached out and took my hand, looking down at it. We don't know what is happening. There are ideas, thoughts, speculations, and nothing more. No mixed race has been successful changing forms and coming back whole. I looked at his hand over mine and nodded. And now I'm not completely a vampire again. He shrugged, running his thumb over the top of my hand. You were never completely a vampire to begin with. Then he looked up at me and smiled. You are unique. A freak, I thought, but somehow couldn't make the words come out. Reina, he said after a long silence, I know that our fathers pushed us to meet for their own reasons. I came here at first, in part, for some of the same reasons. He glanced up at me, but all I could do was watch him. I can't lie and say that your father's title and power had nothing at all to do with it. That wasn't the only reason, even then, but it is even less the reason now. I frowned, trying to sort that information out. He was being honest and confessing to me, but I wasn't angry. How could anyone not think about those things? Track, maybe, but Track didn't like me that way. He was protective and teased me, but he was my best friend. Say something, please, he whispered, his eyes worried. I smiled. Thank you for being so honest, was all I could think to say. His face dropped, and I chewed my lip, trying to think of something better to say. I'm sorry, Jonathan. I don't know what to say. I appreciate your being so honest, really I do, but I'm a bit confused. He nodded, glancing at the doctor, then back at me. I shouldn't be telling you this, after all you've been through. Another pause, and he continued, but also, after watching you go through that, seeing what you went through, I needed to tell you. Tell me what exactly? That I stayed for you and for no other reason. There was a knock at the door and we both turned, but Jonathan kept my hand in his. I smiled as Phil walked in and then flinched as I saw a scratch across his jaw and more on his forearms. They were already healing, but I lowered my eyes. Phil smiled at me and then noticed our hands and frowned, looking hard at Jonathan. Jonathan met his gaze and kept my hand. Phil, I am so sorry, I stated. I had forgotten my hand as I turned to him. He chuckled. Don't you dare try to take any blame for what happened. I'm tough and we'll be fine. They are healing fast. He moved closer to the bed. How are you holding up? I'm still a bit confused, I shrugged, a little worried, a little curious, not thrilled about having to be stuck here for 24 hours. But other than that, I'm great. Phil smiled at me, then leaned over and kissed the top of my head. You are one tough female, and I mean on the inside as well as the outside. What is Ryan's opinion of all of this? Phil sighed. He's worried about you too. He and I are going back to Polson, but he has asked your father to keep him updated, and he plans to come back tomorrow. He says it's our job to watch over you and take care of you as much as it is his. Your job? I flinched and Phil chuckled. You are Pac, Reina, now more than ever, but you always have been. I nodded and then smiled as Track came in carrying a large TV in his arms. The weight was nothing for him, but it was a bit awkward, and Phil moved to help him. Then Phil looked around. We need something to put it on. My dresser was too high, my bench was too low, at least according to them. Finally, Track announced he would go find something else. As he turned, he noticed Jonathan holding my hand, and his eyes moved up and locked on the vampires. Phil walked to the other side of the bed and distracted me by talking, so I didn't see the heated visual exchange that went on between them. When Track left, Phil stood. Marcus is out in the hall and would like to come in and say hello. I nodded, and he called out towards the door. Marcus walked in slowly, and I noticed a gift bag in his hand. He came up to the bed and smiled at me. "So how's the patient?" "Quarantined for the next 24 hours, I chuckled. He held up a bag, and Jonathan had to finally let go of my hand so I could take it. "Just some movies I thought you might like," Marcus explained as I peeked in. I smiled and started to pull them out. They were some of my favorite vampire and werewolf movies, and a few I hadn't seen yet. "Wow, thank you," I said with sincere excitement. "These are great." He nodded. "I knew you had an interest in them." "Yeah, sick, I know, but Track and I love to watch them." Marcus chuckled and nodded again. "So I heard. Do you want to stay and watch some with us?" "As much as I would love to, and I mean that honestly, I have to go back with Phil. We'll come back tomorrow, though," he stated when I frowned. Track came back in with a hallway table. He walked it over and sat it on the foot of my bed, checked its height, then nodded and lifted the TV onto it. "Marcus bought me some movies to watch," I told him, holding up a few. Track looked at the DVDs in my hand and smiled. "Thanks, Marcus. That'll give us something to do." He bent over the back of the TV and fumbled with the cords as another man walked in with a DVD player. Track took it and started to hook it to the TV. My phone rang and I jumped. Jonathan smiled, picked it up, and looked at the screen. "It's Allison," he stated, handing it to me. I smiled and took the phone. She asked how I was doing and wanted to know if I wanted company. I told her not to worry, that I was surrounded at the moment. There was a pause, and I asked what was wrong. "Well, Joel wanted to see a movie tonight, but we both want to be here for you," she stated slowly. I had forgotten she was still staying here at the manor. "Don't you dare miss out on that for me," I smiled. "Go have fun, and let me know if the movie is any good." "Are you sure?" "Completely positive," I chuckled. "Has he talked to your mother yet?" Her voice became chipper again. "I think so. He hasn't said so, but I saw him coming out of one of the offices, and my mother was in there." I was so happy for her. "Make sure you invite me to the wedding," I teased, and Jonathan's brows rose. She giggled. "Are you kidding? I hope you will stand up with me." Wow, that was a huge honor. I closed the phone and Jonathan watched me. "A wedding?" "Allison thinks Joel has talked to her mother," I smiled. "You know, we vampires call them unions," he pointed out, and I stared at him for a long moment. "Yes, werewolves, like humans, had weddings, and vampires had unions. But they both meant the same thing. What was the big deal?" I finally shrugged. "Well, whatever you want to call it, I hope he asks her. I could use some happy right about now." "What? You're not having a good time?" Track commented as he plugged in another cord. I rolled my eyes and Jonathan took my hand again. "I think they'll make a good couple," he stated. "They have the same temperament, and he does seem to care for her." Phil walked over then, and I looked up at him. "Marcus and I have to go take care of some business." I nodded, and he smiled. "We'll be back tomorrow, and I put our numbers in your phone, so you can call us if you need anything." "Hey, I'm right here," Track grunted, untangling himself from a cord. "What else could she need?" Phil chuckled and then bent down and gave me a hug. I had to let go of Jonathan's hand again. Marcus stepped up and gave me a gentler hug, also promising to be back the next day. I watched them leave, and then the doctor stood. "If you would both step outside for a few moments, I need to check her." My eyes widened, and both the guys stiffened. "I will stay," Jonathan stated, and Track moved up by the doctor, watching him carefully. The doctor was unaffected by either of them. I am sure Reina would appreciate a little privacy for the exam. Oh, I gasped and looked at Jonathan and then Track. Jonathan stood and Track shrugged. Hey, we're pack. Besides, there isn't anything we haven't already seen now. Track, I hissed, and he chuckled. Okay, fine, but how long will this take? About 10 minutes, the doctor said calmly as he moved towards his caddy. I eyed it nervously, and Jonathan moved closer to him. Aren't you even a little concerned that stressing her out with this will spark a change again? The doctor turned. If that is the trigger, then it is best we learn that now, he said in a matter-of-fact voice. Jonathan and Track looked at me, and I bit my lower lip and shrugged. When they left, the doctor stepped up to me, and I felt my body stiffen. I didn't shift this time, but I was not happy with all the prodding and poking. He had put a needle in my arm, and it had come out empty. Finally, he nodded to a maid that I hadn't noticed standing by the door. She opened it and went to his computer and started to type away. Chapter 11. The next week was spent in a bizarre spin of events. I shifted about once every 24 hours. When I changed into a wolf, I seemed completely wolf. My memory stayed with me, thankfully, and I was able to retain everything except the pain. Mercifully, the thoughts of that part seemed to fade as soon as I completed a shift. Changing back, however, was different each time. I seemed to have different variations. One time my eyes stayed wolf-like. Another time my heart continued to beat for several hours. Then I went into a coma of sorts and it stopped. There were 2 doctors in my room at all times now, checking me and documenting each change. They had small pen light that had ultraviolet rays in it. Every time, no matter my shape, it burned skin or fur. I was really starting to hate those doctors. They seemed to be enjoying this a bit too much. My body and mind were tossed back and forth, and I grew grumpy and edgy from it all. As the week progressed, the shifts became closer together. By the 7th day, I was changing every few hours. The doctors were getting nervous, and I was completely and utterly exhausted. I laid on my bed in between, staring up at the ceiling and wondering when it would stop. My muscles throbbed, even in vampire form, and my bones seemed to ache to their very core. Track and Jonathan stayed with me every minute, even through the exams now. They would turn their backs, but they refused to leave, and my dad told the doctors to deal with it. The guys were all frazzled looking too, and worn out. They were worn out from holding me when I thrashed, to worrying as my heart stopped, they looked about as bad as I did. I was allowed to take showers, but only with 2 maids in the bathroom with me. Walking became harder since my body was so weak. At one point, I collapsed in the shower. A maid threw my robe over me, and Michael came in and carried me back to the bed. I wanted it to stop. There were times I wanted to die, if that was the only way to end this, completely and utterly. Ryan and Phil were here now too, along with some higher council members. The word had spread, and my father hissed on the phone when he took calls from my room. Finally, on the 8th night, as I lay in my bed after shifting back from a wolf, I looked at my dad, who sat next to me. "I'm sorry," I whispered, my voice too raw from screaming to manage anything more. He shook his head hard. "I'm the one that's sorry, sweetheart. I should be able to help you more, and..." He looked so sad and weak. My dad was always strong, but now he looked almost fragile. "If I do die," I squeaked, "I want you to know that you are the best dad in the world." "Don't you dare leave me," he whispered. leaning over me and pushing back my sweat-soaked hair. You are everything to me, Reina. Everything. His words pulled at my heart, but I couldn't even cry anymore. I closed my eyes and slept, part of me hoping I wouldn't wake up. I wanted this to be over, as much for them as for myself. Track barely slept or ate, and the others paced, their lives put on hold because of me. And I am going to stop there.